In the Black Girls with Queen, I wanted to give a shout out to Ring IQ Boxing, and remember to tune in to the motherfucking relay.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. A bit of news that might come as a surprise to no one, really, since we know that Canelo Alvarez already made the decision to revisit those Caleb Plant talks for a Fox pay-per-view. Apparently, they're reaching a deal. And once again, that's not very surprising. It's the nature of the deal that I think most people are going to be interested in. Eddie Reynoso, Canelo Alvarez's longtime trainer and manager, made it clear that they are promotional and network-free agents, and they don't want to be attached at the hip to anybody. So you have to wonder,
Did they change their minds?
have they decided to enter into what could be a 2-fight, maybe even a 3-fight deal with the PBC on Fox? This pay-per-view is intended to go down in November.
Towards the end of this year.
And we don't actually know how much longer the PBC and Fox are going to be in bed with each other. We don't actually know how much longer Fox as a network is going to stay in the sport of boxing.
Remember what I told you in my previous video?
The people over there at the PBC would have to pull off something dramatic. I mean, they'd have to get some really big names on board, and you'd have to get those big names to make some kind of a commitment in order to provide Fox with an incentive to keep doing business with you. There are already people interpreting this situation with Manny Pacquiao, Yordenis Ugas, and Errol Spence Jr. as a play to get 2 Pacquiao fights out of the deal instead of just one. Pacquiao versus Ugas, and if Pacquiao is successful, Pacquiao versus Spence. If you manage to get Canelo Alvarez on board for at least 2 fights, what you got are 4, count them 4, big pay-per-views.
2 Pacquiao fights.
And 2 Canelo Alvarez fights. That's if you can get those big-name fighters, those big marquee guys on board with you for at least 2 fights apiece.
And we don't know that they have.
And we don't know that they haven't. Though in the event that they do, in the event they can get Manny on board for 2 fights and Canelo for 2 fights, and that comes out to roughly 4 pay-per-views.
Well, that might be very good news for the PBC.
But not very good news for you and me. Not very good news for the consumer, because if that is what happens, you're going to have to shell out roughly $320 for what are 4 fights.
That's the way it breaks down.
Being a boxing fan could become that much more expensive if both Manny Pacquiao and Canelo Alvarez decide to move forward with the PBC for more than just one engagement. We don't know that they will, and we don't know that they won't, but if they do, that's the situation.
And that's just those 2 guys.
$320, roughly, for what are 4 fights. That's not counting whatever else they decide to put on pay-per-view. Remember, these are the same people that had the audacity to put Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Chris Arreola on a Fox pay-per-view. There's no quality control over there.
Wilder versus Ortiz 2 was a pay-per-view.
An $80 pay-per-view for a rematch that nobody was asking for. And you purchase these things at your discretion. If you don't think it's value for money, you don't buy it. But if you want to see Manny Pacquiao in action, and you want to see Canelo Alvarez in action, this caliber of fighters, well, yeah, it's going to become very expensive. It could.
So while this might be good news for them,
It's not exactly good news for us. One is left to wonder if this will provide enough incentive for Fox to continue doing business with the PBC because of what I told you before. They need something dramatic to happen. The fighters they've already got signed, nobody's really interested in those guys. They haven't been putting up big numbers. But if you can get the Canelo Alvarez's and Manny Pacquiao's of the world on board, well, now you're cooking with rice. Now you're cooking with oil.
you gotta watch this story closely.
Because it's hard to imagine that the people over there at the PBC and Fox would pull together $40 million to give Canelo Alvarez up front without any strings attached, without any kind of assurances that he might do more business with them moving forward. They can pool the money together, but for a one-off?
No commitment.
That's hard to imagine. Though in any event, we're going to see what happens, and we're going to see how this affects the boxing world, and more importantly, the boxing fans. Because I reiterate, being a boxing fan, that could become very expensive very soon. In other news, Jake Paul tweeted, Canelo Alvarez's opponent in his 10th fight was 0-0, and whom after defeat never fought again. In my 4th fight, I'm taking on a pound-for-pound decorated fighter who has won on the biggest stages and is considered one of the top welterweights ever. Yeah, and he's still not a boxer, so I mean, what point are you trying to make?
You're fighting guys with no fundamentals.
No fundamentals in a sport of boxing anyways. You'd sooner gain more real experience as a boxer fighting a journeyman whose record is upside down than the guys that are Jake Paul's been fighting. Who's Jake Paul been fighting?
I don't know.
YouTubers, basketball players, MMA guys.
He's clearly getting too comfortable.
The boxing world, can't seem to make up its mind how it feels about this guy, how it feels about Jake Paul. Marcos Villegas responded to Jake Paul's tweet by saying that Canelo Alvarez was only 16 years old fighting grown men in his fourth pro fight.
How old is Jake Paul?
24 years old. I mean, even a Mark DeMaury would be a step up from the kind of guys that he's been fighting.
He's starting to drink his own Kool-Aid is what he's doing.
And it's because the boxing world can't seem to make up its mind but how it feels about Jake Paul, how it really feels. I mean, you've got guys like Jalen Love and Amandia Serrano welcoming him with open arms.
There's a lot of people out there that still think he's a tourist.
There's a lot of people out there that think he's going to stop Tyrone Woodley, because Tyrone Woodley, decorated mixed martial artist that he might have been, he was on the back nine as far as his MMA career. So what does he even have left to give the sport of boxing?
So on that premise, some people think Tyrone's going to get knocked out.
And if he does, it will then become young Tommy Fury's responsibility. Young Tommy Fury, who's a real boxer, comes from a real fighting family. It will then become his job to finish this, where all these other guys could not. All these other guys that wasn't boxers.
Can he do it?
In theory, he should be able to, because Tommy Fury, for all his flaws and all his drawbacks, he actually has been in there with real boxers. Oh, not the best. Far from it, but more boxers than Jake Paul has fought so far, even with the scalp of Tyrone Woodley. Even if Jake Paul is successful once this pay-per-view comes around, Tyrone's not a boxer, and neither was Ben Askren or Nate Robinson or Anderson Gibb before him. I'll tell you what I think. Up until this point, the boxing world just don't know how to feel about this kid. They don't know if he's a benefit to the sport or a detriment to it. They don't know if he's the symptom of a bigger problem or if there's actually something to be gained here. Just don't know how to feel. But from where I'm sitting, Jake Paul's boxing career doesn't actually begin, doesn't officially kick off until he beats an actual boxer. And that's what Tommy Fury is. And if he beats Tommy Fury, then you give him his flowers. Then you'll know that he's serious. Jake Paul, he's got a professional record of 3 wins and no losses, but those are 3 wins against non-boxers. And even Tyrone Woodley, if he beats him, the same applies. Whereas Tommy Fury's got a professional record of 6 wins and no losses. And those 6 wins, those are 6 wins over actual boxers. He's going to be boxing on the undercard of Jake Paul versus Tyrone Woodley against some guy with a record of 0-1. I mean, they're really making sure that they don't put Tommy in harm's way.
Of course not. They want him to fight Jake Paul.
And I do think the pay-per-view is going to be successful. I do think the Jake Paul versus Tyrone Woodley pay-per-view, I do think it's going to do good business. Though in truth, Jake Paul isn't amassing a following as a boxer. He already had a following before he became a boxer.
It's not exactly a professional achievement.
He wants people to look at him as some kind of a professional fighter, a professional boxer. More specifically, he's got to start boxing with boxers, and Tommy Fury's the right man for the job. Hey, listen, Tommy Fury's quality of competition, it really ain't nothing to write home about, but he is boxing with boxers, and if you want to be viewed through that same lens, in that same scope, that's what you need to start doing.
Because right now you're comparing yourself to Canelo Alvarez.
You're actually comparing who he fought in his first 4 fights when he was 16 fucking years old, and who you're fighting in your first 4 fights. And you haven't boxed with any boxers yet. I mean, you do realize that. You do realize how fucking stupid you sound comparing yourself to that guy.
Don't you?
So before you go comparing yourself to Canelo Alvarez, why don't you get past a guy like Tommy Fury first? Then we can talk. Then maybe we can take you a little bit more seriously.
This guy must be trolling.
Other news, a few words from the reigning WBC featherweight champion Gary Russell Jr., who states he wants Tank. He feels he's one of the most feared and ducked fighters in the sport of boxing today. And, you know,
Leo did sidestep him.
and I think that most of us can admit to that, but even with that, does Leo Santa Cruz not fighting Gary Russell Jr. make Gary one of the most avoided fighters in the sport today? This is the same fighter that was offered an opportunity to unify titles with Josh Warrington.
Remember?
Back when Josh Warrington had the IBF title.
Josh Warrington wasn't avoiding him.
It was Gary Russell Jr. himself who admitted that he was made an offer by Eddie Hearn to have that fight, and he decided to reject
He
it.
said it was beneath him.
I'm just going to come right out and say it. I don't think Gary Russell Jr. is one of the most avoided fighters in the sport of boxing here today. That is a gross exaggeration.
Oh, I don't even think Gervonta Davis is avoiding him.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe there was a time when that might have made sense, but There's nothing to worry about in Gary Russell Jr. because the man's barely active. He's barely talked about.
He's not on anybody's mind.
What featherweights are losing sleep at night over Gary Russell Jr.? The man barely fights.
It's already been over a year since his last fight.
He was last in action in February of last year, before the pandemic hit, before the pandemic shut everything down, against his mandatory challenger, Tuxak Niambiar. He hasn't had a fight since.
He had some kind of situation going on with Devin Haney.
And that didn't materialize into anything. He found himself strolling down memory lane, recounting events long since past between himself and Terrence Crawford when they were fucking children.
This guy's got way too much time on his hands.
Claiming that he wanted that fight, claiming that he'd move up to take on Terrence Crawford, and nobody took him seriously.
You know, the WBC ordered him to fight Ray Vargas.
That order came down in January of this year, and in spite of that order having come down in January of this year, it still has not resulted in a fight since we're 8 months into the year of 2021, and Gary Russell Jr. has yet to fight at all in the year of 2021. So when I think about Gary's statements about how he wants Gervonta Davis and he's supposed to be this avoided fighter, I can't help but think that this guy's turning into a broken record. He does this periodically, year after year.
He'll fight once.
Do a million fucking interviews about fights with guys that don't end up materializing, don't end up happening.
Yeah, he's right on schedule.
And you know, I used to sympathize with Gary Russell Jr., I did. I too felt that Leo Santa Cruz was avoiding him and that it was inexcusable because those two active reigning world champions in the featherweight division, they don't have any network or promotional politics or obstacles to have to overcome. They fight under the same banner on some of the same platforms. So there's no reason that the fight shouldn't happen. In that respect, I sympathized with Gary, but when I saw Gary Russell Jr. admit to rejecting $1 million payday for a unification match,
At that point, I'd had enough of this guy.
because this guy's holding that WBC featherweight title for ransom.
He's just as bad as Leo Santa Cruz.
No, granted, Leo didn't want to fight you.
But you didn't want to fight Josh Warrington.
You're both guilty of the same thing, and that's holding up this division. You know what? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. If you want Gervonta Davis so fucking bad, why don't you let that WBC title go upstairs, move up in weight, and stop stifling this division, because that's all you're doing.
If you want him, go get him.
Because all I see is a inactive, absentee champion who's a part of the problem.
You don't fight that often.
You've already rejected one unification match, what could have been a unification match with Josh Warrington, and I'm pretty sure you're not going to pursue another with El Vaquero, Emmanuel Navarrete, or Kid Galahad, the newly crowned IBF champion in the featherweight division.
You're not bringing any excitement to this division.
This guy's barely active. He barely fights. It's been 17 months, roughly 17 months, since his last outing, and you know, WBC don't seem to be applying any pressure on him to defend that title, in spite of it having been 17 months since he last fought, in spite of having ordered him to fight Ray Vargas earlier this year. They're not holding Gary Russell Jr.'s feet to the fire to get out there and have a title defense at least. I mean, they're enabling him to hold that title for ransom.
And there used to be a time when I thought he was avoided.
Yeah, there used to be a time. There used to be. These days, I don't think he's avoided. I think he's irrelevant.
And I don't feel sorry for him.
And finally, boxing scribe Dan Rafael took to social media and stated, even with so many titles, if you follow boxing, it's not that hard to know who's the quote-unquote real champion, or at least number one. In a division-based track record and or recent accomplishments, heavy, Fury, cruiser, Breedis, light heavyweight, Better Beef, super middleweight, Canelo,
Middleweight, Triple G.
so on and so forth. It was Dan Rafael's classification of Tyson Fury as a lineal champion that many of the boxing fans took issue with. One boxing fan that goes by the name of Henners stated, Fury has 0 title defenses, failed drug test, ducked Anthony Joshua, and then conveniently dropped out of the third Wilder fight. He's not number one in the heavyweight scene, to which Dan Rafael replied, Fury has defended the lineal title 6 times. Another dummy who has no idea that being lineal champion has nothing to do with a belt. And listen, Fury's status as a lineal champion, figurative or otherwise, means very little to me, because Tyson Fury is a guy who hasn't fought since February of last year, and those are the facts. I don't really care about what figurative status he might or might not have and how people view him, because you know what he's not doing? He's not bringing no excitement to this weight class. He's not bringing no excitement to this division. And the notion of a non-existent title, meaning more than a real one, that comes with real responsibilities.
It's not like he's taking on all comers.
He isn't. When he was ordered to fight Dillian Veit, he blew that order off. When the name of Alexander Usyk was brought up to Tyson Fury as a potential opponent option, Tyson Fury blew off that notion as well.
And he said it's because Usyk is a foreigner.
So what the hell was Sefer Seferi and Francesco Pianetta?
What was Tom Schwarz?
Tom Schwarz is a German and Otto Wallin is a Swede. You didn't take any issue fighting those guys, but if the name of Alexander Usyk is brought up to you, you take issue. You say he's a nobody, and you ain't got time for somebody like that. You got time for the Tom Schwarzes of the world, but no time for the former undisputed cruiserweight champion, the guy that Anthony Joshua is going to be fighting very soon, the guy he's bringing excitement to this division with.
The excitement that you're not bringing.
You know, I don't actually care if anyone views Tyson Fury as a lineal champion or otherwise, because if he is a lineal champion, the lineal champion of this division, it means Bo fucking diddly in the greatest scheme of things.
Just an excuse to call hand-picked opponents title defenses.
Hand-picked opponents and lighter touches. We're supposed to view guys like Sefer Seferi and Francesco Pianetta as defenses of a lineal title when Tyson Fury retired.
I thought that was the rule of thumb.
That there are only a few ways to lose lineal status. In the ring, which is the more conventional method. In death, if you die, you cease to become the lineal champion. Or if you retire. And I don't know if anybody told Dan, but Tyson Fury retired.
He was gone for 2 years.
And even if new lineage was not established in his absence, even if a new lineal champion was not crowned in his place, that doesn't change that he relinquished that status already. He relinquished it when he retired. And when you prop him up like this, when
you call those fights title defenses,
Seferi, Pianetta, Schwarz,
you're basically enabling those shenanigans.
Those shenanigans which have caused the heavyweight division to become a bit stagnant. Those shenanigans that have kept the WBC title out of rotation for the last 17 months.
You know, I don't actually care if he is or isn't lineal champion.
It really isn't something I'd lose much sleep over, because Anthony Joshua's upcoming title defense of a real title against Alexander Usyk means a lot more to me than Tyson Fury's previous title defenses of an imaginary title.
A figurative one.
Anthony Joshua's defense of a real title with Alexander Povetkin. Well, that means a lot more to me than Tyson Fury's defense of an imaginary title against Seferi and Pianetta and Schwarz and even Otto Wallin.
So what was the Wilder fight, a unification match?
These fucking journos are willing to qualify.
Is that what that was?
It's the only top 10 fighter Tyson Fury's fought since 2018. Anthony Joshua, he fought 2 top 10 fighters in 2018. Several others since.
Unbeaten Parker and Alexander Povetkin.
I mean, if you consider Fury lineal, hey, great. But I'll tell you, being lineal must not mean much given the run that he's having.